there's a specific, more dangerous category worth examining directly, one that requires everything this entire series has traced throughout dozens of previous conversations, but that also demands additional layers of protection this series hasn't yet fully addressed. Today, we're tracing exactly what makes Dark Triad personality patterns considerably more dangerous than ordinary narcissism, and what genuine comprehensive protection actually requires when you're navigating this specific combination. Let's start with understanding precisely what distinguishes this category from the standard narcissistic patterns this entire series has examined so extensively. The Dark Triad consists of three overlapping traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narcissistic psychology, specifically the need for external validation, the structural incapacity for genuine accountability, the attention-seeking that drives so much of the behavior we've examined. Someone displaying genuine Dark Triad traits carries this narcissistic pattern alongside two additional dimensions worth understanding carefully, because their presence fundamentally changes the risk calculation involved. Machiavellianism refers to a specifically strategic, calculated approach to manipulation, not impulsive, ego-driven reaction, but patient, long-term thinking, specifically oriented toward exploitation. This differs meaningfully from the more reactive patterns we've traced throughout most of this series, where manipulation often emerges from immediate psychological need rather than sustained, deliberate planning. Psychopathy, in this specific clinical sense, refers to genuinely diminished capacity for empathy and remorse, often combined with impulsivity and a specific comfort with deception that goes beyond what we've traced throughout this entire series regarding ordinary narcissistic self-protection. This is worth understanding as qualitatively different, not simply more intense. Someone with genuine psychopathic traits often experiences something closer to genuine indifference or even genuine satisfaction at others' distress, rather than the more complex, defensively motivated cruelty we've traced extensively throughout previous conversations. Here's why this combination proves considerably more dangerous than ordinary narcissism, worth understanding through direct comparison to everything this series has established. Remember what we've traced extensively throughout this entire series about narcissistic manipulation, often emerging from genuine, if structural, psychological need, the desperate requirement for external validation, the genuine inability to tolerate confrontation with wrongdoing. This creates, however harmful, a certain predictability, a pattern this entire series has traced consistently across dozens of conversations. Dark Triad manipulation operates according to a genuinely different logic: calculated, strategic, oriented toward exploitation as its own goal rather than as a defensive response to psychological threat. Here's what this means practically for how you need to approach protection differently. Ordinary narcissistic manipulation, as this entire series has traced extensively, often responds predictably to the specific mechanisms we've examined: genuine detachment, calm non-reactivity, the removal of exploitable emotional material. Dark Triad manipulation, precisely because it's more strategic and more patient, sometimes requires additional layers of protection this series hasn't yet fully addressed, because the underlying motivation differs fundamentally from what we've traced throughout most previous conversations. Here's the first critical difference worth understanding directly. Charm functions as a deliberate tool rather than simply a byproduct of genuine, if distorted, desire for connection. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about idealization phases and their eventual devaluation. With ordinary narcissism, this pattern often emerges from genuine, if structurally limited, attempt at connection that inevitably fails to sustain itself. With genuine Dark Triad traits, Charm often functions considerably more deliberately, a calculated tool specifically deployed to build exactly the trust that will later be exploited, without the same underlying, if distorted, desire for genuine connection that characterizes ordinary narcissistic idealization. Let's trace what genuine protection actually requires when navigating someone displaying these dark triad traits, because the strategies this entire series has established need meaningful adjustment given everything we traced in Part 1 about strategic, calculated manipulation rather than reactive, defensively motivated behavior. Here's the first, most critical adjustment. Minimize emotional disclosure considerably more than you would with ordinary narcissism. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narcissists cataloging vulnerable information shared in trust, later weaponizing it during conflict. With genuine dark triad traits, this same mechanism operates with considerably more strategic precision, because Machiavellian patience means vulnerable information often gets stored and used with more deliberate timing, sometimes considerably later than would be typical with more reactive, narcissistic patterns. This means the general caution this entire series has traced regarding selective vulnerability needs to become considerably more restrictive here, extending trust and personal disclosure only gradually, only in response to genuinely sustained, demonstrated consistency over considerable time, rather than the more moderate calibration we've traced throughout most previous conversations. Here's the second critical adjustment. Documentation becomes considerably more essential, not simply useful. Remember what we've traced throughout this entire series about documentation protecting your own clarity and your own case if legal proceedings ever become necessary. With genuine psychopathic traits specifically, comfort with outright comprehensive lying often exceeds what we've traced regarding ordinary narcissistic narrative reconstruction. This means maintaining thorough contemporaneous records, dates, exact wording of significant conversations, screenshots preserved outside any shared or accessible devices, matters considerably more here, particularly if this person holds any power over your professional situation, your finances, or any legal circumstances you might eventually navigate together. Here's the third critical adjustment. Expect considerably less responsiveness to appeals involving fairness, empathy, or shared understanding. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about why direct confrontation and emotional appeal fail against ordinary narcissistic psychology. This failure, worth understanding directly, often stems from structural incapacity for sustained self-reflection rather than genuine absence of any empathic capacity whatsoever. Genuine psychopathic traits represent something more fundamentally different: diminished baseline capacity for empathy itself, which means appeals to "how would you feel" or "this genuinely hurt me" often produce even less response than we've traced regarding ordinary narcissism, and sometimes, worth understanding directly, get processed not as genuine appeal, but as additional information about exactly which vulnerabilities remain available for future exploitation. Here's the fourth critical adjustment. The gray rock method, which this entire series hasn't yet examined in detail, often proves particularly effective specifically against these traits. This technique, becoming genuinely uninteresting, minimally reactive, minimally forthcoming with personal information, works considerably well here because both Machiavellian and psychopathic traits often specifically depend on stimulation and exploitable reaction in order to sustain interest in a particular target. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic strategy depends on emotional material to work with. This dependence often intensifies with genuine dark triad traits, which means becoming genuinely, consistently unremarkable in your responses often produces disengagement more reliably here than with ordinary narcissism, where the underlying psychological need sometimes persists, regardless of how unrewarding the target's reactions become. Here's the fifth critical adjustment, perhaps the most significant departure from this entire series' general approach. Prioritize complete exit over cautious, managed, reduced contact. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about navigating ongoing relationships with narcissistic family members or co-parents, sometimes recommending carefully managed, reduced contact rather than complete severance when circumstances genuinely require ongoing interaction. With genuine Dark Triad traits specifically, the combination of strategic capability and diminished empathic restraint makes long-term management considerably riskier than it would be with ordinary narcissism. If circumstances genuinely allow complete exit, this typically represents the safer choice here, considerably more strongly recommended than the more nuanced, situation-dependent guidance this series has generally offered regarding ordinary narcissistic relationships. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it, rather than leaving this conversation as simply a list of adjusted strategies without addressing what genuinely matters most. How to actually assess whether you're dealing with these more severe traits specifically, and what practical safety planning looks like if this assessment suggests genuine elevated risk. The first thing worth understanding clearly is how to actually distinguish genuine Dark Triad patterns from ordinary narcissism, since this distinction determines which set of strategies genuinely applies to your specific situation. Remember everything we've traced throughout Part 1 about calculated patience versus reactive defense, genuine indifference to suffering versus defensively motivated cruelty. Ask yourself honestly, does this person's manipulation seem to unfold according to long-term, patient strategy, sometimes revealing itself only considerably later than the immediate provocation that might explain more reactive narcissistic behavior? Does their response to your distress seem to include something closer to genuine satisfaction or genuine indifference, rather than the more complex mixture of defensive anger and occasional fragmentary guilt this entire series has traced regarding ordinary narcissism? Have you noticed comfort with outright, sustained lying that goes beyond narrative reconstruction into something closer to comprehensive, strategic deception? Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about not over-applying this more severe framework to situations that don't actually warrant it. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the danger of over-applying protective frameworks in ways that damage genuinely more manageable relationships. Not every difficult narcissist displays genuine, comprehensive Dark Triad traits, and applying the more severe, more restrictive strategies we've traced throughout today's conversation to someone whose patterns actually match the more standard narcissistic profile this entire series has traced extensively risks unnecessary, excessive guardedness that costs you more than it protects. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that connects directly to something we discussed extensively in our earlier conversation about signs of genuine danger and the resources available specifically for that situation. Remember the specific safety planning guidance we traced regarding documentation, professional support, and crisis resources. If your assessment genuinely suggests Dark Triad traits, particularly if this assessment includes concerning behaviors like threats, surveillance like monitoring, or escalating contact after clear boundaries, this deserves the same serious practical safety planning we examined in detail previously. Consulting with a domestic violence advocate or attorney familiar with these specific patterns, maintaining thorough documentation, and taking any explicit threats with the seriousness they warrant, regardless of your own personal assessment of whether the person would actually follow through. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about professional support specifically calibrated to this more severe category. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the value of therapeutic support generally. If you suspect you're navigating a relationship with genuine dark triad traits, specifically seek support from a therapist experienced with this specific combination, since the recovery process, the safety considerations, and the appropriate protective strategies genuinely differ from the more general narcissistic abuse recovery framework this entire series has traced extensively across dozens of previous conversations. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. Recognizing genuine dark triad traits accurately, rather than either underestimating or overestimating the specific danger involved, protects you considerably more effectively than applying generic advice indiscriminately to a situation that requires more specific, more careful calibration. If your honest assessment suggests you're navigating something considerably more severe than ordinary narcissism, trust this assessment. Prioritize complete exit and genuine safety planning over the more nuanced, situation-dependent strategies this entire series has generally offered. And remember that seeking professional support specifically calibrated to this more severe combination represents wisdom, not weakness. Given everything we've traced throughout today's discussion about exactly why these particular traits require exactly this additional, more comprehensive level of protection and care, there's one final truth worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, and it deserves to be the last thing you hold on to, rather than the tactics themselves. Whether you're navigating ordinary narcissism or the considerably more severe combination we've examined today, the underlying principle remains exactly the same, and it's worth stating with complete clarity as we close. You were never obligated to figure this person out. You were never required to become an expert in dark triad psychology, to correctly diagnose the precise clinical combination of traits driving someone's cruelty before you were allowed to protect yourself completely. Understanding these distinctions genuinely helps. It sharpens your strategy, calibrates your caution appropriately, and validates instincts you may have been talking yourself out of for far too long. But your right to leave, your right to document, your right to seek help, your right to walk away entirely was never actually contingent on correctly naming what you were dealing with. If something in you has been screaming that this person is different, more calculated, more genuinely indifferent to your pain than anything this entire series has traced before, trust that. Your nervous system was reading real signals long before you had clinical language to describe them. Here's what deserves to be true, regardless of which category, ultimately, technically, applies. You deserve people in your life who are moved by your pain, not entertained or unbothered by it. You deserve honesty that doesn't require forensic documentation to verify. You deserve a version of trust that isn't a strategic vulnerability someone is patiently waiting to exploit. None of that is asking too much. None of that requires you to first prove, with clinical precision, exactly how dangerous someone was before you're allowed to take your own safety seriously. If you've spent time in a relationship with someone displaying these traits, understand this clearly. Surviving it required a kind of vigilance, a kind of internal strength that most people will never have to develop because most people will never encounter someone who required it. That strength is real. It's yours now, permanently, carried forward into every future relationship where your instincts will recognize danger faster, name it more accurately, and act on it with less hesitation than they ever could before. You are not paranoid for seeing clearly. You are not weak for needing protection. And you are not required to remain in proximity to someone simply because you haven't finished cataloging exactly which traits explain their cruelty. The explanation was never the prerequisite for your safety. Your safety was always simply allowed to come first.